What made this moment stand out wasn't just what Gervonta "Tank" Davis said, but how he said it, because in a setting that was supposed to remain controlled, structured, and predictable, there was a sudden shift in tone that felt completely unplanned, almost like the conversation briefly moved away from the usual boundaries of media training and into something more direct, more personal, and more revealing. And when Shakur Stevenson's name came up, it didn't feel like just another topic being introduced for discussion. It felt like a trigger point, something that immediately changed Tank's focus, his energy, and the way he responded. And when the words "send the contract" came out, they didn't carry the exaggerated aggression that fans often associate with promotional callouts. Instead, they carried a kind of calm intensity, the type that suggests confidence rather than emotion. And that difference is important, because in boxing, the loudest statements are not always the most serious ones, and sometimes the most controlled responses are the ones that reveal the most intent. And in this case, the simplicity of the statement is what made it powerful, because it removed all ambiguity, all speculation, and all indirect messaging, replacing it with something clear, something immediate, and something that felt like a challenge that didn't need to be explained any further. And that clarity is what made fans react the way they did, because it cut through the usual noise of the sport and created a moment that felt real, not manufactured, not exaggerated, but grounded in a level of confidence that suggested Tank wasn't just speaking for the sake of attention, he was speaking from a position where he believed the fight made sense, and more importantly, where he believed he was ready for it. To fully understand why this moment carried so much weight, it's important to look at the context surrounding both fighters, because Gervonta Davis is not someone who frequently places himself in situations where he needs to verbally push for fights. His career has largely been defined by performances inside the ring, where his power, timing, and ability to end fights suddenly have created a reputation that speaks for itself, and that reputation has allowed him to operate from a position where he doesn't need to chase attention, it naturally follows him, which is why a direct call-out like this feels different coming from him, because it suggests a level of intent that goes beyond the usual promotional cycle. And at the same time, Shakur Stevenson represents one of the most technically refined fighters in the sport, someone whose style is built on control, discipline, and an ability to limit his opponent's effectiveness in ways that are not always exciting in a traditional sense, but are incredibly effective at the highest level. And this contrast between Tank's explosiveness and Shakur's precision is what has made their potential matchup such a consistent topic of discussion among fans, because it presents a clash of styles that feels unpredictable, not because either fighter lacks ability, but because their strengths operate in fundamentally different ways, creating a situation where the outcome depends not just on what each fighter can do, but on how those abilities interact when placed under pressure. As the clip from the interview continued to circulate, what stood out even more than the words themselves was the reaction they created, because within minutes, fans, analysts, and even other fighters began to interpret what had been said from completely different angles, with some seeing it as a genuine call-out that could push negotiations forward, while others viewed it as a calculated move designed to apply pressure without fully committing. And that division in interpretation is exactly what gives moments like this their power, because it keeps the conversation alive, constantly evolving as new perspectives are added. And in this case, the simplicity of Tank's statement made it even more effective, because it left just enough room for speculation without losing its directness, allowing people to project their own expectations onto it, which in turn amplified its impact far beyond the original context of the interview itself. At the same time, it's impossible to ignore the fact that Shakur Stevenson has built his own narrative within the sport, one that is very different from Tank's but equally compelling in its own way, because while Tank's identity is closely tied to explosive finishes and highlight what makes Tank's statement particularly interesting in this context is that it doesn't attempt to break down the matchup or explain why he believes he would win. Instead, it bypasses all of that and goes straight to the point, focusing entirely on the idea of making the fight happen. And that approach shifts the conversation away from theory and into possibility, because rather than debating who has the advantage, it introduces the idea that the only way to truly answer those questions is to see the fight take place, and that shift in focus is what makes the moment feel significant, because it moves the discussion closer to reality, even if only slightly. Real knockouts. Shakur's reputation comes from his ability to control fights with a level of precision that often leaves opponents struggling to land clean shots, and this difference in style is not just a technical detail, it is a defining characteristic that shapes how each fighter is perceived, how they approach their opponents, and how fans imagine a potential fight between them unfolding. And when you place these two contrasting styles in the same conversation, it naturally creates a sense of intrigue that goes beyond simple comparisons, because it raises questions that don't have easy answers. However, the reality of making a fight like this is far more complex than a single statement, no matter how direct it may be, because boxing operates within a structure that involves negotiations, timing, financial considerations, and strategic decisions from multiple parties, all of which must align for a fight to move from concept to confirmation, and this complexity often creates a gap between what is said publicly and what actually happens behind the scenes, which is why moments like this, while impactful, are only one part of a much larger process that determines whether a fight will actually take place. Despite that complexity, statements like "send the contract" still carry weight because they influence perception, and perception plays a significant role in shaping the direction of the sport, as it affects fan interest, media coverage, and even the decisions made by promoters and networks. And when a fighter of Tank's profile makes a statement that feels direct and confident, it creates a narrative that can build momentum over time, increasing the pressure for the fight to happen, or at the very least, keeping it at the center of conversation. From a stylistic standpoint, the potential matchup between Tank and Shakur remains one of the most intriguing in boxing, because it represents a classic contrast between power and precision, where one fighter relies on creating moments of impact, while the other focuses on limiting those moments through control and discipline. And when these approaches collide, the outcome often depends on which fighter is able to impose their preferred conditions, turning the fight into a battle of control as much as skill. Another layer to consider is the psychological aspect of such a matchup, because fights for Tank, maintaining his usual approach would mean finding ways to close distance, create openings, and capitalize on those openings with precision and power, while for Shakur, the challenge would be to maintain distance, control the pace, and avoid the kind of exchanges that could play into Tank's strengths. And this dynamic creates a scenario where both fighters are essentially trying to force the fight into two very different directions at the same time. What makes this even more compelling is the fact that both fighters have shown the ability to adapt, which means that the fight would not remain static, but would likely evolve over time as each fighter adjusts to the other's approach, creating a layered and unpredictable contest where the outcome is shaped by a series of small decisions rather than a single defining moment. As discussions around the potential fight continue, it becomes clear that the interest goes beyond the fighters themselves, extending into the broader narrative of the sport, where matchups like this represent the kind of high-level competition that fans want to see, and that desire plays a role in keeping the conversation alive, even when there are no immediate developments. At this level are not just physical contests, they are also mental battles where confidence, composure, and the ability to remain focused under pressure can influence the outcome just as much as technique. And in a fight where both fighters have strong identities and proven success, the psychological dimension becomes even more significant, as each fighter looks to assert control not just through their actions, but through their presence. At the same time, it is important to recognize that not all highly anticipated fights come together, and that the path from discussion to reality is often unpredictable, influenced by factors that are not always visible to the public, which adds another layer of uncertainty to the situation. This uncertainty, however, does not diminish the significance of moments like Tank's statement, because even if the fight does not happen immediately, the impact of the statement remains, shaping how the fighters are perceived and how future discussions unfold. In many ways, the power of this moment lies in its simplicity, because it takes a complex situation and reduces it to a single, clear message that resonates with fans, creating a focal point for discussion that can be easily understood and shared. As time goes on, the true impact of this moment will depend on what follows, whether it leads to further statements, negotiations, or developments that bring the fight closer to reality, or whether it remains a standalone moment that continues to fuel speculation without immediate resolution. Regardless of the outcome, the fact that such a moment can generate this level of attention highlights the importance of narrative in boxing, where stories, rivalries, and moments of tension play a crucial role in shaping the sport's appeal. What makes this entire situation so compelling is not just the words that were said, but the timing and context in which they were delivered, because in boxing, moments like this don't exist in isolation, they connect to a larger narrative that has been building over time, a narrative shaped by performances, reputations, fan expectations, and the constant search for matchups that feel meaningful. And when Gervonta Davis made that statement, it didn't just introduce a new idea, it tapped into an existing conversation that had already been growing, amplifying it in a way that made it impossible to ignore. And that amplification is what transformed a simple sentence into something much bigger, something that carried implications not just for the two fighters involved, but for the direction of the division as a whole. Because when two high-level fighters become linked through moments like this, It creates a kind of momentum that can influence decisions, shape perceptions, and ultimately determine whether a fight moves closer to reality or remains part of the ongoing discussion that defines the sport. As fans continue to analyze what was said and what it might mean, it becomes clear that the real power of this moment lies in its ability to create questions rather than provide answers, because instead of offering a detailed explanation or a clear path forward, it introduces uncertainty, and in boxing, uncertainty is one of the most powerful drivers of engagement, as it encourages debate, speculation, and ongoing interest, and in this case, the uncertainty revolves around multiple layers, from whether the fight will actually happen, to how the styles would interact if it does, to what each fighter would need to do in order to impose their approach on the other, and these layers combine to create a narrative that feels dynamic and evolving, one that keeps fans invested not just in the outcome, but in the process of getting there, and that process, with all its twists and possibilities, is what makes the sport so compelling. In the end, what this moment represents is more than just a call-out or a headline, it is a reflection of how boxing continues to operate at the highest level, where individual statements can carry significant weight, where narratives are constantly being shaped and reshaped, and where the line between reality and possibility is often blurred, creating a space where anything can happen, and it is within that space that the sport finds its energy, its tension, and its ability to capture attention. Because whether or not this particular fight becomes a reality, the impact of the moment remains, influencing how the fighters are perceived, how the division is discussed, and how fans engage with the sport moving forward, and in that sense, the true significance of what was said goes far beyond the words themselves, extending into the broader story of boxing as a whole.